In the beginning, there was a covenant. And the people organized themselves around the covenant and said, what matters is how we are together. And the people saw that it was good. That was the beginning of our history as Congregationalists. Our Unitarian Universalist faith is descendant from the Puritans who came to New England in the early 1600s for religious freedom. Now, while there is a lot we would disagree with those folks on, one thread that we have pulled with us over the last 400 years is covenant. To this day, we are Congregationalists, people who find and make meaning together in a local congregation by entering into covenant with one another. As the Unitarian and Universalist Heritage Society writes, our ancestors, quote, granted ultimate religious authority solely to that convincing power of truth evident in understandings reached and tested over time by a body of loving individuals mutually pledging faithfully to seek and heed truth together in ongoing community. Another important thread in our history arose in the 1700s. Many of the Congregationalist churches in New England at that time began to hold reason as a part of our religion, even incorporating new scientific discoveries and philosophies into theology. For instance, Newton's understanding of the universe's order was seen as clear evidence of God's work. These churches began focusing on reason and the human ability to make moral choices as the road to salvation, against the Calvinist notions of the elect. Now, the more conservative churches at that time were holding fast to those Calvinist notions and began calling the liberal churches Unitarians, which was a slur at the time. They also began bringing creeds into their congregational covenants to make doctrine part of what separated them from those dirty Unitarians. The more liberal churches, in turn, resisted creed and went deeper into covenant, focusing on making meaning together from the best understandings and knowledge of the time. Now, by the early 1800s, there was clear division between the liberal and conservative Puritan churches in New England. William Ellery Channing, the liberal preaching champion, finally owned both the liberal theology and the name in his famous 1819 sermon, Unitarian Christianity. Our liberal religious ancestors officially became Unitarians and broke from the conservative Congregationalists then in the early 1800s. But by the mid-1800s, a new fork in the road showed up. Ralph Waldo Emerson preached the famous Divinity School address in 1838, 20 years later. He delivered this address to the graduating school at Harvard, the primary educational institution for Unitarian ministers, and in it, he incites those new ministers to breathe life back into the dusty, tired traditions of their forefathers. It's 20 years later, and the denominational thinking was dramatically shifting once again. The cutting edge of the new generation of Unitarian saw the foundational changes of the previous generation as dry and dogmatic. In this new move, Emerson, understood as the father of transcendentalism, preached that God is alive not dead, not stored in a dusty book or an old dogma, but is living and breathing through every human being in every moment. Religion done well, he said, helps us understand that each of us is, quote, an infinite soul, that the earth and the heavens are passing into our mind, and we are forever drinking the soul of God. Emerson preached in that divinity school address that the shining religious insight that we still hold fast to today, the spark of divinity, lies within us all. When we tap into that deep root of spirituality and align it with the highest good, Emerson wrote, quote, when love warms us, when we choose the good and the great deed, deep melodies wander through our soul from supreme wisdom. Then we can worship and be enlarged by worship. In the sublimest flights of the soul, rectitude is never surmounted, love is never outgrown. 1838. We can keep going through the next 200 years, and you will find major controversies in every generation where people engaged with our faith, with our history, with the best of ourselves right now and the knowledge of the times we live in to wrestle with the big questions. What is moral? Who or what is or is not God? What is holy? How should we live? How will we be together? In each new turn along the long road that we've been on as a faith, new and beautiful, brilliant insight was gained. And the beauty and the brilliance and the insights of the threads of the previous generation also continued. We are still based in covenant and reason and free will of the early days. We also practice the direct experience of transcendence brought to us by the transcendentalists, and so many other threads over the generations as we have kept growing and learning and loving and making meaning in community together. Our tradition is living, and every generation we come back to the table to wrest meaning out of the day. You will find many, many beautiful threads in the tapestry of our living tradition. The thread of truth, the thread of reason, the thread of direct experience, the thread of justice, and the thread of love. In 2018, our congregation here at First Church engaged in a deep and collective community discernment process about our mission and our values and our ministry. Hundreds of our members participated in reflecting about who we are and what matters to us most and where we want to go together. We collected all of that input, and then our very courageous and very committed Board of Trustees worked hard to articulate just 4 core values and 8 ends, things that we want to create together in ministry as a community. Now, the 4 values came together relatively quickly, although the board did struggle to explain them and choose the exact perfect right word. Our 4 core values as a congregation, those things that hold us together and ground all the ministry that we do, are wonder, authentic connection, justice, and love. The struggle that I remember most clearly in the board trying to articulate those 4 core values was, surprisingly, whether or not to include love as one of the values. I know, that's a little surprising, right? But the struggle was this. One of our board members didn't want to include love as a value because it was so much bigger and more important than all the other ones. She kept saying, love is the ground of everything that we do. It holds all the other values. Love is the container. Now, the board did end up including love as one of the 4 core values as a congregation, but not because she was wrong about it being the ground of everything else, just because they didn't know how to say that in the format we were using. Unitarian Universalists believe a lot of different things about God and have the whole time, as you just heard, historically. Because we are a living tradition, not only do our people have diverse beliefs about God, but we are also, as a faith, open to change in those beliefs over time and with new knowledge and understanding. Even the word God means different things to different people at different times, and we, as a faith, resist the hubris of believing that any of us has the one true, right knowledge in this very moment. One way to understand what God means is God is the most powerful force in the universe. So what do you think is the most powerful and pervading and ubiquitous force in the universe? Sometimes people say change. Sometimes people say energy. But the word that I hear Unitarian Universalists use most often and most interchangeably with the word God is love. In our theology, in our hymnody, in our justice work, we very often proclaim love as the most powerful force in the world, the all-pervading, larger thing that holds us. This thread, the thread of love, comes to us from both our Unitarian, but especially our Universalist heritage. The Universalist tradition was born when people of various denominations came to believe that a loving God would never condemn human beings to everlasting hell. The origin, the foundation of universalism is an all-pervading love that is more powerful than any finite human wrongdoing. And as you heard earlier, in Unitarianism, it was the turn towards human goodness, warmed by love, that awakened our souls to God. The most recent draft revision of our Unitarian Universalist principles, purposes, values, and sources grounds us in love. It says that the purpose of the Unitarian Universalist Association is to actively engage its members in the transformation of the world through liberating love. That is why we exist, to transform the world through love. They found a way to ground everything in love. We needed them 5 years ago. At the beginning of the section that talks about our shared values as a faith, the draft revision writes, "Love is the power that holds us together, and it is at the center of our shared values. We are accountable to one another for doing the work of living our shared values through the spiritual discipline of love." The spiritual discipline of love. Now, if you're excited about this Article 2 revision, and I can tell that you are, I do want to name that we have an Article 2 team here at First Church. They're going to be in coffee hour in the common room after church wearing red garlands with little hearts on them. If you want to talk to them about it, our anti-racism team members will be there as well. Ultimately, this revision is aimed to ground us as a faith more deeply in love and to name it and claim it as the bowl that holds all the rest of our values, to name it and claim it as the thread that we're following through the generations. But what does following that thread look like? What does saying that this is at the center of how we want to be together mean? What is that transforming, liberatory power of love? Some of our friends in Milwaukee, you might know them, Arno Michaelis and Pardeep Kaleka. They've been teaching about the transforming and liberatory power of love for a long time. In the early 90s, Arno was a founding member of one of the largest hate groups in the country, a white supremacist group here in Milwaukee. Arno said, as we radiated hostility into the world reflected hostility back to us. But the liberating power of love slowly started to make its way through the world and into Arno's heart. He had a job, and one day, while he was in active alcohol addiction, he came into work painfully hungover with nothing to eat, and he spent his lunch in the break room with his head in his hands, trying not to be sick. His co-worker, a black man who was younger than him, saw him suffering and gave Arno his sandwich. And that was the beginning. That was the seed of love that cracked open Arno's hard shell and slowly started to sprout. Over time, Arno saw more and more acts of love by people that he had dehumanized, and he began turning away from white supremacy, eventually becoming a former who now works to de-radicalize white supremacists and teaches love and tolerance. Pardeep Kaleka moved with his family to Milwaukee in the 1980s. Pardeep's father, Satwant Singh Kaleka, helped found the Sikh temple in Oak Creek. According to Pardeep, they had a fairly typical immigrant experience as a family, and by the time Pardeep was an adult with a family of his own, they felt that they had made it, that they were living the American dream. His father had a successful small business and was president of the thriving Sikh temple. Both his sons were doing well. Pardeep had his own family. They had just bought a home. But in the summer of 2012, a member of the gang that Arno started walked into the Sikh temple that Satwant Singh Kaleka had founded and began shooting. In the end, he killed 7 people, including Pardeep's father. At first, the relationship between Pardeep and Arno was a quest for answers. Pardeep couldn't understand why someone would do what the shooter had done, and he asked Arno to meet with him. He needed to ask questions. He needed to understand why someone could be that brutal and violent. And here, in this moment, is where the spiritual discipline of love comes in. Because it is in this moment that the spiritual discipline of love asks more from us than an easy feeling. It asks more from us than just sitting next to someone we like. It asks us to show up in the hard stuff, to go to the scary places, to be present in the pain and the suffering and the discomfort and the confusion and the disagreement and the sitting across the table from one another. The 2 men met, and Arno shared his experience of how hate is corrosive to the human soul. And through that meeting, Pardeep started to gain understanding. Eventually, the two men became friends. And they say now that they are like brothers. They founded an organization together called Serve to Unite, which teaches children of all ethnicities in all neighborhoods all over Milwaukee about waging peace and engaging in a tough and serious spiritual discipline of compassion and love. Following the thread of love takes us deeper into relationship. It takes us more deep into our Unitarian Universalist covenant in communities. It asks us to keep showing up with one another, even when we disagree, even when something seems scary or hard, something is changing. We still show up and listen to one another and wrestle with it together. We make meaning together as a community. It is time to do that wrestling again. The last time the principles were revised, the principles and purposes and sources were revised was in the 1980s. It's been 1 or 2 generations. It's time for us to have this conversation and follow the thread of love and watch where it leads us. And that includes love and compassion for everyone who is in disagreement, for people who are grieving losses, those who are struggling with change, those who hate this change. Love for all of that. It's the big bowl that holds us all. A spiritual discipline of love is difficult. The kind of wrestling that we have committed to do as a faith tradition because we are living is difficult. We are in the process of wrestling with one another because that is what we've committed to practice as a covenanted community that shows up in love with one another. And we're holding on to all of the other threads, the thread of the interdependent web of all existence and the inherent worth and dignity of every human being, and telling the truth and living in covenant and supporting the democratic process and experiencing transcendence directly. We are bringing all of those threads with us. And we are sinking deeper into the ground of liberating love. May it be so, and amen.